Hello and welcome to this extremely exclusive webinar series. Here we have today a very valued speaker. Colm, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Natalie. My name is Colm. I am account manager at AssessFirst, basically meaning I oversee a portfolio of strategic partners and clients. I've been in the company for just over 8 years. So basically in the kind of assessment space, HR, talent space for almost a decade now. And over the past year and a half, I also have the very exciting role of leading our expansion throughout the GCC.
Amazing. Thank you. And hosting this conversation today will be myself, and I currently head up all of the content and production for the HR portfolio here at Informa. So, Colm, let's get started. Today we are going to be speaking about, strategic recruitment and upskilling specifically. Yourself being an expert from the assessment industry, it's a great opportunity to really explore the innovative strategies for identifying and nurturing the different talent, specifically in the GCC region. I guess that kind of segues quite nicely into my next question, which is, what are the unique challenges of identifying top talent in the GCC region, in particularly in Dubai to date?
Yeah, it's I guess it's a really interesting time and it's a really interesting market. The GCC and specifically Dubai is such a dynamic market. It's such a competitive market, but there are definitely kind of three unique elements to it, as you mentioned. I guess the first one specific to GCC and really specific to Dubai would be this kind of, I guess it's sort of an extreme diversity. A lot of the research shows that there's about 85 to 90% of expats making up the population. So basically, what that means is that you are looking at talent pools and recruitment across hundreds of different nationalities. You have hundreds of different social norms, communication styles, cultural norms, education backgrounds. And I guess specifically in the GCC, it's not about, filtering talent, but it's really about how do we decode the potential across all of those kind of diverse pools. In a lot of other markets, there's maybe standardized approaches, whether it's good or bad, we'll talk about in a second, but standardized approaches of evaluating based on experience or education, because in a lot of markets they're comparing, apples with apples, whereas that doesn't apply in Dubai. It's really different and really diverse. We have to find other ways to evaluate that talent. What else? I guess maybe also in the GCC, it's a really fast-paced environment. It's really everything in terms of growth. The organizations, the companies are scaling really at a quick pace. And that means that often, specifically when we're looking at recruitment, we're faced with situations where decisions need to be made as quick as possible. And then the third one, which isn't necessarily specific to GCC, but more of a global phenomenon, and I'm sure, Natalie, it's something you're talking about every day, is, this transformation that we're living with AI. It's transforming not only the way we recruit, but it's transforming all of our lives. And it basically means that today candidates are no longer applying to roles in the same way. We're no longer assessing them in the same way. We're no longer making decisions in the same way. So this kind of huge transformation at this unique time is really impacting that as well for us.
And you actually brought up quite an interesting point, particularly at the start of what you were saying around, this large expat community, which is currently in the GCC. Now, just out of interest, have you noticed that there's particular challenges as it relates to, particular skills? Is there commonality in the different nationalities that these skills belong to? I don't know if you've noticed a pattern there. That'd be quite interesting to talk about.
No, I think actually the problem is, or well, not the problem, but the context is that there's not necessarily a pattern. In other markets, it's easy to have a pattern and to use that pattern. Whereas in this market, it's so diverse that it's very difficult to have kind of a standard pattern or to recognize a standard pattern for these diverse profiles with diverse backgrounds and education systems. So, as we'll talk about later as we go into it in a bit more detail, it's really about having a standardized process, and it's really about focusing on the key success factors for each organization and then standardizing that amongst their diverse talent pools, let's say.
And I guess, talking about pre-screening, and pre-interview assessments. How can we really how can pre-screening and pre-interview assessments really improve the efficiency and objectivity of recruitment processes?
I think when we're talking about efficiency and objectivity, often there's two topics. So one is, I guess, the time to hire, and then I guess the other is the quality of hire that we're making. So with the time to hire, often we're looking at, the main problems we tend to see are in that pre-screening, that pre-filtering phase. How do we go about that? How do we improve that? How do we automate that perhaps? And in terms of that phase, I mean, definitely the days are finished, are gone off recruiters sitting down and manually screening 300, 400, 500 CVs. That doesn't exist anymore. Times have changed. And so for, the pre-screening or for the assessment stage, it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, that we have looked at the key factors of success or the criteria. So, what is the first filter? What is the criteria in order for this candidate to be able to move forward? So whether that's, their availability or whether it's their salary expectations or whether it's, their visa requirements, whatever it is, what is that information that is the killer information in order to continue the process? For that, we need to find ways to automate that first step of screening. So whether it's automating the CV screening, if we can find that information available on CV, or whether it's introducing AI agents to do that first pre-screening calls for us. And then the second part, in terms of the quality of our, is really going to be looking at, again, the key success factors for the role, but this time in terms of more the behavioral aspect of the candidates to ensure that they're aligned, to ensure that they have the necessary skills to achieve. So for me, there's that kind of real three-step approach. It's defining the success fact predictors, use that for the screening of the CVs, use that for the measurement of the behaviors, have something standardized, and then prioritize that data as part of that process for us.
You mentioned automating the pre-interview process. Now, something that's come up quite a lot in our research, particularly in Informa, is that a lot of folks are actually using AI to write their CVs, and that doesn't necessarily reflect
Yeah.
their experience. How do you work with AI, or how do you collaborate with AI to make
Mm.
sure that we're really shortlisting the correct candidates and trying to filter out those who maybe have used AI to write their CVs?
And look, let's be honest, 99% of candidates today are going to be using AI to write their CV, right? And I would tend to say, well, why would you not? When you have these tools that can help you and push your CV to the top of the pile, why would you not use those tools? So that's the reality that we're looking at. So what we're faced with is, well, how do we handle a situation where we might have 500 CVs and maybe 499 of those CVs all look the same? So I think, as I said, there's two factors. The first factor is we have to have AI tools that are going to be finding the necessary information for us. So if that is screening a CV, it's going to be looking at the key factors, but like I said, in terms of availability, in terms of visa, in terms of, requirements, whatever that might be. If we realize that actually we're not getting that from a CV today, times have changed, maybe we need to look more at the automation in terms of AI agents that are going to be asking those questions for us. And that will allow us to validate, okay, first of all, they have the criteria in order to be able to move forward in this process. But actually, I think a bigger part of the conversation is, how do we go above and beyond that classic method of looking at a CV? Again, as you said, the CVs are looking the same. Individuals are using AI to write their CVs. So we need to look at other factors. And for me, one of those factors that we're going to be looking at is really that kind of potential elements, the behavioral elements. Is this individual aligned to the criteria in terms of behavior, in terms of potential for the role, and not just looking at their previous experience or education, let's say?
So it definitely sounds like a lot of work needs to be done before any of this process starts, right? To identify what kind of behaviors, what skills employers are really looking for to fill the role. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
What needs to be done before this whole pre and during interview process?
Yeah, and you know what? That's a really important step because it's also the step that will ensure that we're removing bias from the process. Classically, when we're looking at things like education and previous experience, I really think it's like a reinforced bias. So you're right. A really important part of this work that we're going to be doing is the first step, which is where we sit down and we say, what are the key success factors for this role? And as I mentioned earlier, there's two sides to those key success factors. The first side is the actual requirements. And I mentioned, visa requirements, salary, whatever it might be, availability. We have to validate if we're recruiting somebody that's going to work weekends, we have to validate that this person is available and okay to work weekends. So that's the first set of key criteria. And then the second set of key criteria is what is needed to succeed on this role. So what are the behavioral elements we're looking at? Are we looking at somebody who's very comfortable in terms of the social aspect, approaching other people, networking? Are we looking for somebody who's incredibly organized? What are the soft skills that are important? And then also, what are the specific job skills that are going to be important? So typically, before we start this process, we'll have our three columns in terms of requirements that will allow them to work in this position, the soft skills, and then potentially the job specific skills. And if we have those key success factors, we're not going to be getting caught up in the factors that can reinforce bias of, experience or education or where they live or, background or anything like that, let's say.
Soft skills, you've mentioned them, which are quite interesting. Why would you say, I mean, why are soft skills becoming increasingly important in today's talent landscape? And not only that, but how can organizations assess them effectively? Because traditionally they have been quite hard to sort of
Yeah.
measure in terms of success.
Yeah. So I guess if we go back to the context that we shared at the beginning of the call, which is this idea that specifically in the GCC, we're looking at really diverse populations, lots of different cultures together. And then also we said, we're living this transformation time. AI is completely changing our lives and the way we operate and the way we recruit. And actually, one of the other kind of knock-on effects is, I think it was the World Economic Forum released a study not too long ago to say that I think it was 40% of the skills we use today are expected to change by 2030. So it means that, actually those technical hard skills, those skills that we're classically assessing, it's going to become really difficult in the future because we might be assessing them today, but in 2 years they're obsolete. So how do we tackle that? How do we approach that? And I guess that's where the soft skills are really going to bring in the importance and that predictor element in terms of future success. So when we're looking at the populations today, I would say more so what's going to be important are identifying populations that are going to be adaptable, that are going to have emotional intelligence, that are going to have that learning agility, that are going to have the cultural intelligence that we mentioned to allow them to work with those diverse populations and adapt their communication. So those factors moving forward are going to be much bigger predictors of performance and success than maybe the technical skills. So what I would really recommend is that we have, again, a standardized process in place. We're using psychometrics that are grounded in science and results and data. And we're using that to help inform our decision-making process as part of that recruitment drive, let's say.
And what do those psychometrics look like for something like adaptability or agility? What would they look like for an organization?
So it's a really simple process, and there's lots of tools on the market. Of course, I can only speak highly of AssessFirst, but there's lots of tools, and essentially what we're doing is we're getting candidates, and we'll speak about maybe the internal use case as well in a few minutes. But we're getting candidates to complete a short questionnaire. We're looking really at above and beyond their CV, above and beyond their experience. Who is this individual? What are their natural talents? What is their potential? How do they operate day to day? And specifically, we're looking at the potential of this individual within the specific context of the role they've applied for and the specific key success factors that we mentioned that are associated to this role and potentially the specific manager and teams they'll be working with. So it's all about that short questionnaire evaluating the potential of the candidates and putting that into adequation with the key success factors that we mentioned earlier to ensure that there's an alignment and that there's a good potential for success for those individuals.
Sure. And, moving on to the more job specific skills assessments, what role do they really play in ensuring candidates are right for both the role as
Yeah.
well as the organization?
Job skills are still really useful, and job skills are definitely something that will help us predict immediate success, let's say, in the role. And if we're looking, for example, if we're recruiting for cybersecurity, then there's no doubt, we'll need somebody that has good knowledge of threat detection, network security. Those are skills that are non-negotiable basically in that process. But I guess what we're also realizing in terms of organizations is that these roles also require high levels of analytical thinking, of adaptability, of collaboration. So I think the most effective hiring strategies have the combination of both. It's the job specific skills that will help us predict the immediate success within that position. And then it's maybe the behavioral assessments that are going to help us predict the long-term success. Um, the one thing that I would mention in terms of the job skills is, again, I think times have really changed and we've moved away from off-the-shelf assessments. So, generic assessments looking at specific skills, I think that's a thing of the past. And I think what we're looking at today is a much more specific approach where we're taking job specific assessments, but we're putting the individuals and candidates in the specific environment of the role they've applied for, of the company they've applied for. So it's a much more personalized touch than maybe classically what we would have been doing.
And how can organizations really integrate L&D assessments into their talent strategies to really foster this idea of continuous growth and upskilling, which I know are pretty big buzzwords within the industry today?
Yeah. So I think I think this is a really interesting one because I think all of the forward-thinking companies today are the companies that are moving away from this idea of, assessments are hiring tools, and instead they're really seeing assessments as being part of the wider talent ecosystem, I guess. And for me, one of the challenges that I've seen in some organizations, and thankfully it's changing, but in some organizations, is I still feel like some are treating recruitment and internal talent as sort of neighbors, whereas actually they're roommates, they're living together. And it's not this idea of recruitment should be focusing on hiring people and L&D should be focusing on training people, but it's more of an idea of that continuous evolution, that continuous thread throughout those two topics. And I think what's great today is that we're seeing much, much more positions of chief people officer. We're seeing, head of people and culture. And those positions are great because it means the company has a much more holistic view on what's happening across the board. And it's less of a separation, less of a silo between recruitment and internal talent. So I think where we should be or where we should be moving towards for organizations is this idea of using assessments as part of the recruitment process, of course, to potentially shortlist, but then to assess the talent and ensure that they're aligned. And then that data should be constantly putting through, and it should be used for the integration and onboarding of those individuals. We should then be using it to help manage those individuals effectively according to their styles and their behaviors. We should be using it to help those individuals work with their teammates for their development, for their mobility. So these same data that we use as part of that recruitment process should be pulled through for the full entire life cycle of the employees, basically.
I think that's a really important point because what it sounds like you're getting at is that, L&D should absolutely be strategic. Now, unfortunately, within the GCC, as you know, HR and L&D, they've all more or less been seen as slightly more administrative functions as opposed to
Yeah.
strategic functions, essentially. What would your advice be for some of our audience who may be watching this, who think, oh, well, we're still falling a little bit behind, we're still seeing L&D and HR as more administrative functions. What would your advice to them be as to start their journey to be able to make these functions more strategic and the importance of it?
I think, and it is happening, like I said, with chief people officer and those type of roles, it is happening. But I think those topics need to be brought into the strategic conversations. Like you said, they're kind of, for a long time, they were maybe considered more of an admin topic and aside from that. But actually, those topics are going to affect everything in the company. So, not even looking at the actual specific recruitment parts of time to hire and performance and quality, but actually those topics are going to be playing into the organization strategy in terms of leadership gaps and leadership development requirements. It's going to help us identify and manage training initiatives. It's going to help us with, things like burnout and attrition in the company. It's going to help us reduce the time to recruit, as I mentioned, which is saving the company money. So it's part of the global strategy of the company. So these people involved in these talent initiatives, whether it's internal or external, need to be part of those strategic conversations because the results are having a direct impact on the company's profits and the company's results. and the company's employer brand as well, I should say.
For sure, for sure. And, going back to this idea of CVs, what are the best practice for qualifying CVs to ensure that recruiters focus on the most relevant candidates? What would your advice on that front be?
I think maybe we mentioned this earlier. I think it's important to have your success criteria detailed out. And I think I mentioned, the three kind of the three steps, which is the first step of the requirements of the, availability, visa, salary, all of that information. The second step then would be potentially the soft skills, and then the third step, the job specific skills. So I think specifically in terms of that CV step, those kind of initial stages, we need to again define that success criteria. Once that's defined, we need to then understand how can we automate that step to do the match between the criteria and potentially the CV. So there's lots of tools today that can help you kind of scan the CVs and tell you if it's matching those results. So that's the first opportunity. And then the second step potentially that I would advise as well is sometimes or potentially the information that we're looking for isn't easily or readily available on a CV to help us make those initial filters or screening. So in that case, I would really recommend that we start looking at sort of AI agents to help us automate that step. And essentially, the AI agent is going to be doing that manually, that manual CV screening that the teams would have been doing a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and assessing the candidate, evaluating the candidate, and saying, okay, these candidates meets the criteria. You don't need to sit down and evaluate 500, 600 CVs. Here are the candidates that have the potential, that meet that criteria, and are now ready to move forward in the process. And I think maybe just one thing that I think is worth mentioning or is important because it's something that we hear a lot is the human touch in the process. Companies are concerned about keeping the human touch and maintaining that contact with the candidates, which I'm 100% on board with. We need to keep that human touch and we need to maintain that, collaboration and work with the candidates. The only thing I would say is that we also have to be forward thinking and accept transformation and embrace transformation. And realistically, there's no human touch in an individual sitting down and manually screening 600, 700 CVs. And there's no human touch in an individual doing 10 pre-screening calls a day to ask about their availability and their experience. Those are areas that we can automate, ensuring that the human touch is based on the high potential candidates.
Yeah, and I think, AI is huge at the minute, right? I think a lot of folks here are probably not only wondering where to start, which is maybe a conversation for another day, but once it's integrated, where do you see this going? Where do you see AI really fitting into recruitment and this whole idea of assessments and L&D in the next sort of 5 to 10 years?
It's only going to continue. It's not going anywhere. As you said, it's kind of part of our life today. So we have to kind of understand how to use it efficiently. And I guess I would say that every company is maybe slightly different. So the problems we're facing might be slightly different, even though there's these trends that we mentioned. Every company is different. So it's about identifying where and how AI can help us make our lives easier and make us more efficient and ensure we're meeting our objectives. So, whether it's tackling the high volume, then of course there's tools we can put in place, like we mentioned, with the CVs and the initial steps of automating those steps. Whether we're facing problems internally in terms of turnover or diversity or whatever it might be, it's about identifying how AI can help us tackle that specific problem that we're facing. It's not about introducing AI just for the sake of introducing it, but it's really evaluating the process today, what we need to work on, and then how AI can help in each step. But I think, Natalie, as you said, it's not going anywhere, and it's going to be part of the recruitment process. It's going to be part of the onboarding process. It's going to be part of the integration process. It's there for every step of the way. So we just need to learn how to effectively use it, I guess.
Sure. Now, I know a lot of organizations are currently in the process of sort of analyzing their current tech stack and, all everything which relates to the tech stack when it comes to HR and assessments, L&D. I'd love to discuss a little bit more about data. Data is
Mm.
coming in as a pretty big hitter within L&D nowadays, and it really guides a lot of strategic decision making within organizations. So I'd love to know from your point of view, how how can data-driven insights transform recruitment and talent management into a strategic advantage?
Look, it's huge, right? And I guess I guess there's the two parts. The first part is specifically if we just continue on recruitment for a second. Data is going to be what will help us to reduce the time to hire. It's going to help us improve the quality of our recruitments. It's going to help us improve attrition. It's going to help us with the internal mobility process, whatever it is. But having that data is going to allow us to understand and recognize the trends and the key factors of success, like I mentioned, everything. And it's going to help us to achieve those results. But above those specific results, in terms of that kind of recruitment process, what we're looking at is the data helping the more bigger picture or the leadership questions, because that data is then going to be able to help us understand the specific competencies internally that predict performance in this specific organization. And when we understand that, we can then in turn tailor and personalize the training of those employees to help ensure that they're in line with those competencies. It can also indicate to us, why certain teams outperform other teams. And again, that helps us then train and support those teams that need to, pick up the slack or whatever that might be. And then it helps us identify, I guess, potentially the behavioral patterns that correlate with things like retention. So all of this data is feeding into the bigger picture for companies of retention, of performance, of engagement, all of those topics. So the data is a key point for every organization, and the data is what is giving HR credibility at the executive table, like we mentioned earlier.
And as it relates to specifically recruitment and retention, now these two are huge issues, as we know, in the Middle East, actually recruiting from a big talent pool, as you've mentioned, but also retaining those recruited candidates. Now, if an organization was to start their data journey tomorrow, what would you say are the top three metrics for both recruitment and then separately the top three metrics people should be tracking for retention in the Middle East?
Again, I would say that every company is slightly different. So the data or the challenges that we're facing in each company might be slightly different and might be tailored to those specific contexts. But across the board, I think there is certain data that is always going to be of interest, no matter what the company and no matter what the context. That will in turn, like I said, have those strategic advantages of saving money and time and all of those things. So I think specifically in recruitment, there's certain data that everybody is going to be or should be tracking. The first thing is the time to recruit. So obviously really important that we understand how long it is taking our process and in turn, what that equates to in terms of time and money. The second thing that we should be looking at is things like validation of trial periods or validation of the contract. So really important to kind of look at the correlation between the decisions that are being made and the people that we're bringing on board and actually the fact that they stay in the company and perform well. And then I think maybe moving more so internally in terms of the data that we're going to be using. The first one is the most basic, it's engagement. So engagement is obviously going to be something that predicts or feeds into other things, like I said, like attrition and performance. If we have populations that aren't engaged, you can be sure that it's going to have a knock-on effect on the performance and the attrition of the employees, which of course is going to have a knock-on effect on the benefits and the profits of the company. So I think engagement is something that's really going to be important for us to look at. And then I think maybe secondly, in terms of the internal piece, we can be looking at things like mobility, development, mobility, those sort of data in terms of kind of how often does mobility happen in the company? How often are we training and upskilling our employees? And again, that sort of thing will feed into the turnover, it'll feed into the attrition, it'll feed into the engagement piece as well that we mentioned. So I think across the board, those are really the things that would be important for us to look at for recruitment, but also for the internal piece.
Sure, yeah. And how can results analysis from assessments really help HR leaders make slightly more informed and strategic decisions? And specifically, what steps would they need to take to really analyze the different data sets? Because I think a big problem at the minute is, yes, we've collected all of this data, but how are we extracting insights from them? What do we do with it once it's collected? So what kind of steps can leaders take to really help them make these informed and strategic decisions?
So I guess to go back to what I mentioned at the start, the first step is really to understand what equates to success in our company. So it's about identifying what are the behavioral traits, what are the competencies, what is it that equates to success in this company, in this role, in this environment, in this team. So assessments can actually help us do that as well, of course. So we're going to be using the assessments to identify that data of what success looks like for us. And then once we have that data, we're then going to be able to use that in terms of the recruitment to evaluate if somebody's in line with those success metrics. So first step, identify the success metrics for each position, for each role, for each company. Second step, use that within the recruitment process to ensure that there's an alignment. And then on the internal piece, again, it's a similar idea. It's this idea of using the data to understand the level of skills or the level of competencies that we have amongst teams. So what's really interesting today is we're seeing all these companies that are adopting this sort of skills first approach, which is, it's amazing. Um, for a lot of companies today, as a first step, what I'm seeing is that it's often a very self-declaration method. So it's employees basically flagging their skills, and companies are doing a sort of matching between the skills and the company. So what is important today and where assessments bring in a value and where the data brings in a value is kind of assessing those skill sets amongst your teams and employees. And basically, what it means for companies today is you can have a sort of output or a dashboard for your employees that essentially shows the skills for the roles today or the skills for the future roles. It highlights the level of capability of those skills for each of our team members. And then that data is going to help us to be pinpointing kind of the initiatives that we need to put in place in terms of developing and training those skills. So again, it's really across the board in terms of using that data.
Amazing. Now, moving slightly more on to the people element, specifically to diversity and inclusion, which has been an increasingly popular topic within the Middle East.
Yeah.
What steps can organizations really take to promote diversity and inclusion through unbiased assessment methods today?
Do you know what? It's an interesting question because as we mentioned earlier, in the GCC, it's such diverse populations. It's so diverse. It's so kind of rich in terms of backgrounds and culture. So we know that we have the diverse populations there. So if we don't have the diverse populations in the workforce, there's a problem, right? Something isn't going right in that process and how we're doing things. So I think what we need to be looking at in terms of these diverse populations is maybe not the classic approach that we would have previously, which would have been, education, and which might have been previous experience and these types of things that can actually reinforce kind of bias in the process. But instead, going back to what we mentioned, we need to standardize the process. We need to standardize the selection criteria. We need to know what the key factors of success are. And specifically, I would advise to focus on behavioral data and not necessarily background. So we want to remove any of the subjective elements that we might find, on a CV, for example, and instead look at, what are the behavioral traits that is going to ensure that somebody succeeds in this role. And when we're focusing on those behavioral traits, we're kind of removing any of the sense that might be, in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of education, in terms of background, and we're only focusing on something that will predict their success in the position. So if we have something really standardized for every role, every candidate is going through the same process, every candidate is being compared against the same success criteria, and we're not kind of looking at somebody's, hobbies on a CV or whatever that might be, it means that at the end, we should come out with a really diverse population, but a population that is also going to succeed and thrive in that role based on their alignments to the key factors that we identified at the beginning of the process.
And on this point of objectivity, what would you say are the broader implications of embedding objectivity into recruitment processes for long-term organizational success?
But it's the same. It's kind of what we mentioned earlier. It's going to have a knock-on effect of everything. because those diverse populations are going to be what brings us the flavor to the company and the different ideas and the different styles and the different communication ways. So once we're focusing on the key factors of success, the diversity behind that is still there. We still have these wide populations that are going to be putting through to the business and essentially driving success forward for the business. When we have those different backgrounds and different cultural norms and different communication styles, that's going to be the richness of our company, and that's going to be what the teams will use to drive that success forward, let's say.
And just to close off now, Colm, I've realised, gosh, we've spoken for almost 40 minutes here. It has flown by. I'd love to know from your side, do you feel there's anything on this topic that maybe we haven't discussed that we should have discussed today?
No, I don't think so. I think for me, just I guess the key takeaway is that we have to be looking to have these more standardized processes. We have to be looking to really know what we're looking for in that recruitment process. And like I said, those key success factors. And I think most importantly, we have to be embracing the transformation that we're going through and the changes that we're going through, and to be able to embrace the changes by identifying where those new tools and innovations can help us in that process with the recruitment, with the L&D, with the internal piece. And as we said, that's directly driving the results of the company in terms of leadership, in terms of attrition, in terms of time to hire. All of those topics are directly linked. So I think we just need to be kind of embracing those solutions and implementing those solutions as we go.
For sure, for sure. Well, thank you ever so much, Colm. We've loved having you on here today, and we really, really appreciate all of the insights that you've shared with us. And everyone else, please do connect with Colm on LinkedIn should you have any further questions based off of this discussion. I'm sure he's more than happy to answer some. But aside from that, I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and please take care until next time.